Okay, so I've just been editing the podcast, and unfortunately the first 6-ish minutes of audio has not really recorded. Mine and Jack's microphone was off, so we've had to just boost Zach's mic up. Really sorry about the audio quality for the first 6 minutes though, but it does get better after that. So if you can just stick with it to 6 minutes, I promise the audio does get better.
Hello and welcome to Truss Issues, the podcast where we track the first 100 days of Liz Truss's premiership. Joining me today are Zach Michaelis, TLDR's editor-in-chief.
Hello, Jack.
And Ben Blissett, TLDR UK's lead writer.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Good. Yeah, good. It seems to have calmed down significantly.
For Liz Truss?
Yeah, Liz Truss, yeah.
I don't know
Not much.
We've just been desperately searching for Liz Truss, and I don't know what's happened.
No.
She's suddenly fallen off the radar.
She went to Lidl on Sunday. No, I have no idea.
We sent out a man to follow her around. That's not true. Don't feel like that should be illegal. Someone's going to come around. Okay, so Truss is out, as I think people ought to know by now. We're yet to rebrand the show, though by Thursday we will have rebranded. So, what is happening in politics? What is the big story right now?
Yeah, so... Thanks, guys.
It's just your notes. You've got such good notes again. So just
already. And yeah, no, it's Suella Braverman is still
Suella.
The story is still going on. It's Labour are still calling for her basically to be removed as Home Secretary. There's still a lot of backlash to her. So effectively, she's today published a letter which she sent to Dame Diana Johnson, who's the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee.
Yeah.
So this letter is sort of designed to explain what had happened, how she had sent emails to her personal email address, and how that then got sent to the wrong MP. And she sort of explains why that didn't have national security concerns, presumably just to try and show that she's being transparent and to try and maybe dampen some of the backlash that's gone towards her. So she sort of starts this off by giving some context. It all happens around the 18th, 19th of October.
Okay.
So the 18th of October, she was saying that she was drafting a written ministerial statement about legal and illegal migration.
Yep.
The day after, on the 19th of October, she does this sort of chronology of her day to try and explain why what happened. I think some parts aren't really justified. I don't think it makes a lot of sense. So she says that she started at 4 a.m. And she took part in an operational raid with the crime agency.
it's like one of those like CEO what I do in a morning video.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think the reason she put this in is to try and show that she's tired, she's hardworking, all this, because I don't see why this has any relevance other than that.
It's that.
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, this is what I'm saying. And then she says that on the way back from this, on the car ride home.
At what time?
I think it was about 6 a.m.
Still early.
So yeah, she didn't have her phone that she'd given by the pub. She had her personal phone, so she put the wrong email address in to an MP that she was emailing the draft written ministerial statement to.
Yes.
And she tried to CC in the secretary's, the MP secretary's email address as well. That didn't work. She then she figured out later in the day about 11 in the morning that she'd sent it to the wrong person. So she emailed back saying, please can you delete the message and ignore.
Which is just, if you got that email, delete and ignore, you're absolutely opening every attachment.
Yeah.
What kind of a red flag is that?
Well, the other thing is that doesn't, there's no guarantee that that's going to happen. No, as you say, they could have opened the email. That's a very small thing to do after that. She was then met by the Chief Whip and Andrew Percy MP later on, and she kind of bumped into them in the lobby. Andrew Percy was the one who the email had gone to unintentionally. He seemed quite furious, and that in the report this morning sent an email. She documented the email that was sent by him. Yeah. And he was basically saying, how can this have happened? I've told the Chief Whip, and then it got escalated and went to Liz Truss.
Yeah.
She also then goes on to admit that she often emails herself government documents, because when she's on and I don't understand this, when she's on a Teams call, she goes on the Teams call on her departmental phone, so she can't read notes on that and be on the call apparently. So she'll email it to her personal phone, read the notes on her personal phone.
Does she not have a laptop?
Does she not have a laptop? There's also, I'm sure there's things on phones where you can do split screen, but nonetheless.
iPhone probably not.
Well, yeah.
iPhone's pretty.
So
she
then finishes it up by basically saying she's been given extra training.
Yeah.
And
she's been given an iPad.
She promises not to do it again. and therefore she should remain in her job. That's basically it. She ends the whole thing by saying, the review of my use of government and personal IT has now concluded and the matter's closed, which is remarkable that she thinks she can judge when the matter's closed. So I'm sure the media won't take her view on it. It didn't really explain too much. It sort of just, some of the explanations seemed quite weak. But I doubt this is going to put to bed many of the, the issues that people have with this.
What do you make of this, Zach?
Well, I think last week when we talked about this, I said it wouldn't make much of a difference to the wider trajectory of Sunak's premiership. I think this story has a bit more purchase than it would do in normal times, in part because there's not much else going on, so this is sort of dominating the headlines, but also because I think this is something I failed to sort of realise when we were talking about it last week, but also because this story essentially paints Sunak's new government with the same brush as the old government. So Sunak is obviously trying to reinvent this government as yet another iteration of the Tories. But this story has all the hallmarks of a Johnson/Truss story.
Yeah.
It has the incompetence, doing it 6 times instead of just once, and the fact that you're a Home Secretary. I mean, you're supposed to be quite security conscious.
You'd hope so.
There's an element of dishonesty in there because in her resignation letter to Truss, she claimed that she rapidly alerted the Cabinet Secretary of the breach. But actually, her new timeline that Ben just outlined says that there was a 2-hour gap between her realising and then her alerting someone. And then finally, there's this classic sort of Johnsonite failure to take responsibility, like this reluctance to apologise. And Ben, again, detailed it very nicely, which is, basically, the end of the letter, she says the matter's closed. I have decided the matter's closed. And then obviously in that time that she gives, she has this whole spiel about how she was up really early in the morning. And so, give me a break, you know. And I think that's why the story is worse for Sunak than it might seem at first glance. It's just because it's consistent with the problems that plagued the Johnson and Truss government, and it's going to make it's going to make it a lot harder for Sunak to reinvent this as a new government.
Do you think this matter's closed, Ben? Obviously, Braverman says that it's closed, that she thinks it's been concluded and reviewed and whatever. Do you think, one, that this will be officially the end of it? Is that the expectation? Is there more review to happen? And from a kind of media politics perspective, do you think this is over, or do you think we'll continue hearing about this?
Well, I think Zach's absolutely right that this is only really big because there's nothing else really happening.
Sure.
I completely agree with that. And to be honest, I think that as much as it is sort of rattling on and it's still continuing, it doesn't feel like it's the same level of scandal that we had during Liz Truss and Boris Johnson. This isn't reflecting on Rishi Sunak's premiership. I know it's still really early days. And I think I said this last time, if this continues, if things like this continue, then it might become regarded as the first of a number of scandals. But, that all depends on the future. But on its own, I don't think it's really that much. I think that in terms of whether it's going to continue internally and whether it's going to continue within government and whether there's anything extra to come here, the ministerial code is presided over by the Prime Minister. Rishi Sunak said again today that he has full confidence in her. Previous Prime Ministers, that doesn't really mean much. That could mean that she's gone by the end of the week.
Yeah.
But I do think that the only reason that this is really continuing is because there's nothing really else happening. I think it's unlikely that he's going to sack her based on this. And to be honest, I think once the media get their teeth sunk into something else, they'll sort of forget about this. I think most people don't really care too much because it's as she detailed in there. It's not. I'm not defending her. I think it's still. She broke the ministerial code.
Yeah.
But she explains that it didn't contain any top secret information. It didn't contain anything anything sensitive.
Yeah.
So I think the wider public don't really care that much, to be quite honest.
If it turned out that it was something really sensitive or personal information about someone who was I don't know, it's similar to the Donald Trump situation, and there being information about a foreign government's nuclear whatever, or agents that are undercover. If it was that level of breach, you can see the increased scandal. But I think you're right that I don't know. And I also agree with Zach though that this is a bad beginning for what was meant to be a new chapter. There is, as you say, all the hallmarks of previous failed governments, and also just the fact that she was always a fairly contentious pick. If it had been another minister, it might have been glossed over even more, but people were already unhappy that she was there because of this the first time round.
I remember when she first resigned, there was talk the day after of she resigned based on the timeline that I just explained and all of that. But there were people the day after she resigned sort of speculating about whether it was something else, and there were sort of MPs coming out and saying, "Oh well, ministers do this happens from time to time. It seems like quite a small thing to resign over. Perhaps there's been a falling out between Braverman and Truss, etc., etc." Perhaps people just didn't have all the information back then, and maybe it is bigger. But I just, I think it's just that there's not much else really happening at the minute.
Speaking of not much else happening at the minute, let's go back to Liz Truss, the kind of titular hero of this podcast.
Titular hero?
That's good. That's good. What do you know
no,
about
just
that?
hero. I didn't think you'd ever describe Liz Truss as your hero.
Of this podcast.
Right, yeah.
I didn't say she was my hero. Hashtag not my hero. Liz Truss's phone. Also security issues here, right? Kind of not the same story, but kind of similar world. What's happening with Liz Truss's phone?
Yeah, I think this is probably much more serious. But this was from a little while ago. So the story broke this weekend. It was from the Mail on Sunday, claimed that Liz Truss's phone was hacked when she was Foreign Secretary, so not when she was Prime Minister, when she was Foreign Secretary, by foreign agents. They believed that it was Russia that was behind the attack, and they believed that they might have been able to... foreign agents might have been able to intercept private messages exchanged between Truss's personal phone and foreign officials.
Yeah.
Apparently this first became known to the government during the summer leadership election.
Yes.
And Boris Johnson and Simon Case, who was the cabinet secretary, decided to not let the public know about this. So this has only just come out. Obviously, this is huge if it is true, and it demonstrates that there's going to be some serious questions about security, and it's another case involving a personal phone of a senior minister. So both of these things happening over the weekend probably isn't the best luck.
No, I agree with that. I think it's one of those stories where had it come out while Johnson was Prime Minister, it would have been a massive story.
Yeah.
The fact that the Prime Minister was actively suppressing what was a very, very serious national security breach.
Yeah.
And he's in a sense lucky that he's not.
Yes, true.
But the other thing I'd say about this is today there's been a very interesting story. Well, it's not actually interesting, it's completely unbelievable. But Russian intelligence have claimed that because they had access to Truss's phone, that Truss sent a text to Biden saying, quote unquote, "It's done," 1 minute after the Nord Stream explosion. As sort of like proof that the UK blew up Nord Stream. Yeah, because that is exactly how international diplomacy works. Truss texts Biden with a sort of like Bond-esque, "It's done." And it's just one of those.
Is the implication then that it was the British that did it?
On behalf of the US, that's the implication.
That's always good for the special relationship.
Yeah.
Maybe we should claim that did happen.
It's always flattering, isn't it, when the Russians see us as sort of like the secret superpower.
Yeah, I know.
Little do they know. Well, I mean, they do know we're run by Liz Truss. We're definitely not a
I
superpower.
think it makes it more believable that Truss might try and be quite cool and say it's done. Like, I do believe that Truss would do that.
Yeah, maybe she would actually. Sort of cosplaying
Yeah,
James Bond.
exactly.
Yeah, possibly.
There's serious implications to this, though. This kind of brings to light an underlying concern about security, especially in relation to Russia and China, who have quite significant powers in this realm. Do we think this is a broader concern beyond just Liz Truss and her secret texts about Nord Stream?
I mean, clearly the civil service and certain elements within government, Tom Tugendhat, again, we mentioned, he's a good big proponent of this sort of thing, are very worried about Chinese influence in the UK and essentially Chinese intelligence capacity in the UK. So I think, that is something to worry about, but I also think that it's one of those things where our relative laxness in this respect is more a symptom of the fact that for most of the past decade, we haven't really been engaged in essentially what might be described as a Cold War against any major power. But now that, clearly public and political sentiment is the belief, that basically both the electorate and the political class believe that we are in a sort of Cold War we're in basically a hot war with Russia and a Cold War of sorts with China. You should expect security to improve over the next couple of years or so. I think that we're just playing catch up here. We've been too relaxed about it for too long, and now we finally realise that actually that we are in a war of sorts with relative superpowers, and things will improve, or you'd expect them to. At least.
You'd hope so, because as time goes on, as we become more and more digitised, there's more cameras, more microphones everywhere. This is a genuine, serious concern. So I guess let's hope some real action is sparked by this. Staying on the kind of Russia note and the kind of hot war, as you described it there, there's some new polling out by Ipsos looking at the UK's general public's opinion on the war in Ukraine and kind of situations like that. Do you want to run us through this, Zach? Because some interesting data that's kind of brought to life here.
Unfortunately, Ben has the notes just there, so I think you might be better placed. Oh, okay. Thank you. Very kind. The broad strokes overview of this polling is essentially that while public support for essentially sanctions on Russia has waned, it's still a majority position in the UK. So the latest polling basically suggests that 52% of Brits are in favour of economic sanctions on Russia, even if it incurs some sort of economic costs, while 23% are opposed. That is down a little bit from, I think that the peak was basically in March, when it was about 73% in favour and just 8% against.
So a big swing.
It is quite
still
a big
majority,
swing.
but the number of people who are against has gone up quite significantly there.
Yeah, I mean, in some sense that's unsurprising though, isn't it? Because obviously, back in March, if you remember, it's sort of hard to even think back to March, but in March we were talking in really distant hypothetical terms about possible energy price rises, and that was when energy price cap predictions were only at like a couple of £1,000s. You know, people saying you have a 60% increase in energy bills. Obviously now we have the energy price guarantee, which lasts until April. But we had a lot of talk about essentially energy bills going up by sort of 400%, 500%, at least compared to what they were in 2020. And it's somewhat unsurprisingly, that's going to really freak people out. And I think that's going to be exacerbated by the fact that the government is clearly planning to roll back some of the support they originally proposed, because apparently we don't have the fiscal space to go through such a massive package. So I think you should expect some increase in the amount of people opposing it, but I think it is still interesting and probably more remarkable that it's still a majority position. And if you exclude don't knows, I mean, that's like 70% of people who are actually saying one way or the other. And that's pretty impressively significant. And I think that at least before the war began, this was a line both in the fringes of the British media and on Russian state media. The idea was that while the Europeans might be enthusiastic about the war now, when winter comes and the prospect of, basically high energy bills in the context of cold temperatures comes around, support will wane pretty quickly. But that is just not what's happened. I think there's a couple of reasons for this. I think one of the main reasons actually is that there is what you might describe as elite consensus on the issue. There's a consensus amongst the main political parties that we want to be hawkish on Ukraine and we want to support Ukraine and we want to support sanctions on Russia. And that's in part a function of the fact that that's a Europe-wide position or even a transatlantic position, obviously. But we're also lucky in that respect because I think if you can imagine that if one political party, a major political party, was pushing back against sanctions, as has happened in places like Italy, as has happened obviously in places like Central Europe, so places like Serbia, for example, you can imagine support might wane just that bit more quickly. And the polling bears that out, obviously. I mean, Italy, there's more scepticism about sanctions than there is here in the UK. That's, again, in some part a function of the fact that the media environment there is very different because it's dominated by right-wing radio stations owned by Silvio Berlusconi. So I think that's one of the reasons. I think one of the other reasons is that Europe has coped remarkably well with its transition away from Russian gas. I think that now it looks increasingly likely that we have enough gas as a continent to survive the winter. I say survive, we're always going to quote unquote survive the winter, but we have enough gas as a continent to survive with a relatively mild recession and probably fewer excess deaths than people were originally predicting back in March. But the main reason that's important is not just because it means we have a milder winter per se this time around, but we've invested enough in LNG infrastructure and we've transitioned quickly enough that this is no longer looking like a sort of 5-6 year problem. If you remember back in like March, some European politicians were warning that actually it's not just going to be 2022 winter, 2023 is going to be difficult, it's going to be all the way through to 2027, 2030. And I think that if that had been your pitch to the European public, you're going to have to be cold for 5-6 years, they wouldn't have sucked it up. But I think that actually if you can just say to them, listen guys, it's this winter, this is the one winter, once we're through this, the Russians haven't been able to export their gas, their revenues are going to drop off a cliff, they won't be able to fund their war effort. that's an easier pitch,
Yes.
essentially. And I think that's really helped. I think the other, I'm sorry, this is a bit of a rant, but
No, go for
I
it.
think the other interesting thing is that there has been polling from the other side of the wall, as you might say, from the Levada Center in Russia, which is just about the only credible polling institution inside Russia. Obviously, you still take these numbers with a pinch of salt, because they're still, in some sense, subject to indirect oversight from the Kremlin. But the Levada Center's most recent polling from October says that, and I have the notes here, so I'm going to do some reading, says that 57% of Russians now support peace negotiations in Ukraine, which is massive.
That's
it's huge. Yeah, and you can compare that to last month, where it was 48%, whereas 44% were saying continue the special military operation. Today, only 36% want to continue the special military operation.
Yeah.
And this is largely driven by the partial mobilization. And that's something that, no matter how good your grip of the media environment, as you know, the Kremlin has a great grip over the media environment in Russia, you can't hide that from an electorate. You can't hide that from a population. The fact that you are taking hundreds of thousands of young men off the streets and putting them on the front lines in Donbass. And clearly the Russian public is realizing this, which is why support is waning. Just to give you some more numbers on this, the most recent polling from October says that 53% of Russians think the military operation has been successful. And while that might sound like a lot, 31% say it's unsuccessful. And that's a really significant minority. That's, especially, again, given the grip that they have on the media environment there, you wouldn't expect 30% of Russians to be saying it's not going well. And also, again, polling taken with a pinch of salt, it could be even higher. And again, that's massively down from March, when only 15% thought it was going badly and 73% thought it was going well. So what's interesting is that you're really in this, we sort of have this race between European and Russian public sentiment, assuming that the Kremlin is susceptible to political pressure. Because if the European public sentiment can essentially weather the economic costs of the war in Ukraine until Russian public sentiment turns, then you should expect the Russians to essentially want to end the war faster. You see what I mean here?
Yeah, I see what you're going.
You're in sort of and as things stand, the rate of the rate at which Russian sentiment regarding the war in Ukraine is deteriorating is faster than that in Europe.
Yeah.
Which is good news for Ukraine, I guess.
Yeah.
Might change over the winter, obviously.
Who knows?
We've had a very mild October so far, but
yes.
That's the broad overview.
The only thing that I would like to, and I know this goes back slightly to the Ipsos polling, but the only indication from the data that was released today that public sentiment in the UK is starting to wane is the amount of people who have said that they'd be happy to support the UK government continuing its economic sanctions, even if they lead to, and then there's a number of things, and one of them is increased energy prices.
Yeah.
So 73% back in March said that they'd be happy to continue with economic sanctions even if they did lead to higher energy prices.
Yeah.
That's dropped now in October to 41%.
Wow.
So that's quite a significant reduction, and that's probably because people are starting to feel the increase in energy. Back then it hadn't actually gone up that much, whereas now it's roughly about doubled. But obviously that's still 41% saying that even now they'd still be happy to see energy prices get worse. But that's the only sort of
that is a
Zach's
definite
border
shift.
point. I completely. That's the only thing in there that suggests that public opinion is starting to wane. But on basically all the other indicators, it seems that it's not.
I suppose that one being the one kind of makes sense, though, because that is the area where most blame has been attributed to the sanctions and to Putin's illegal war in Ukraine, because that is what politicians are saying. Prices are going up because of the war. And that is predominantly true. I mean, there's other factors as well, but that is a major factor. And I suppose in other areas, politicians are careful not to turn sentiment and not to blame the war too much for things. But I guess with energy prices, they're kind of desperate to push blame somewhere else. So therefore they're saying, look, the reason prices are higher is because of the war and sanctions and all those things. So therefore, I guess it makes sense that if you're being told to draw that line, then that feels more kind of linked,
energy,
more personal. And energy is so,
Yeah, in percentage terms, has seen the highest rate of inflation of all possible commodities. Yeah, so.
Well, some interesting data for sure.
Some interesting data. That's always such a good way of ending any of those.
With some interesting data.
Interesting.
By looking at some graphs they can't see. What a great way to end. Thank you very much for joining us for what I'm going to call the last episode of Truss Issues. We will officially be rebranded by the time we next speak to you at the end of the week. Probably to Rishi Business. It seems to be the most popular one.
We like Rishi Business.
I don't mind Rishi Business.
Ben doesn't like Rishi.
Ben
don't like
actively
it.
doesn't like. I'm fairly neutral. It's not as good as Truss issues, I gotta say.
No, it's not.
I don't need to explain the Truss issues joke again, but it works on level. Whereas Rishi Business, it's just a pun.
Yeah.
Well, we'll join you next time for Rishi Business.
What an enthusiastic outro.